You are reading this in a world shaped almost entirely by war. The borders of every country you can name were drawn by conflict. The languages you speak descended from populations that conquered or were conquered. The political systems you live under emerged from the aftermath of wars that ended centuries before you were born. The roads beneath your feet follow routes that armies first cut through wilderness. The cities you live in were built on sites chosen partly for their defensibility. Even the calendar you use to organize your days was reformed by Julius Caesar, a general. War did not happen to human civilization. War built it. But here is the part that most histories leave out. The war that built your world did not begin with armies and states and generals and siege weapons. It began in the darkness of prehistoric time, tens of thousands of years before any of those things existed, among small groups of people with stone tools and bone spears, who had exactly the same nervous system you have right now. And what those early conflicts looked like, and what they did to human psychology and human social organization, is one of the most important and most disturbing stories in the entire history of our species. To understand ancient human warfare, you first need to destroy a myth that the 20th century created about the prehistoric past. In the 1960s and 1970s, influenced partly by the horrors of two world wars and partly by a genuine desire to understand human violence, many researchers and popular writers promoted what came to be called the noble savage hypothesis. The idea was that prehistoric humans, before the invention of agriculture and the state, lived in relative peace. That warfare was a product of civilization, not a precondition for it. That the violence of human history was something imposed on a naturally peaceful species by social structures and resource scarcity that agriculture created. It was a compelling idea. It was also wrong. The archaeologist Lawrence Keeley at the University of Illinois at Chicago spent years collecting and analyzing the physical evidence of prehistoric violence. His 1996 book, War Before Civilization, compiled data from hundreds of archaeological sites and skeletal analyses from cultures around the world and across tens of thousands of years of prehistory. What Keeley found was that the rate of violent death in prehistoric societies, measured as a percentage of total population, was dramatically higher than in any modern nation-state, including the most war-torn societies of the 20th century. The 20th century, with its two world wars, its nuclear weapons, its industrial-scale slaughter, was actually one of the least violent periods in human history by the only metric that matters when comparing across timescales: the percentage of people killed by other people. Prehistoric warfare was not rare. It was not a last resort used only when other options failed. In many prehistoric societies, it was a near-constant feature of life. The evidence is in the bones. Skeletal remains from prehistoric sites around the world show rates of trauma consistent with interpersonal violence that stagger modern imagination. A site called Crow Creek in South Dakota, dating to approximately 1325 AD, contained the remains of nearly 500 individuals, most showing evidence of scalping, dismemberment, and perimortem trauma, wounds inflicted at or near the moment of death. This was not war in the modern sense. It was the near-total massacre of an entire community. Crow Creek is not unique. Similar sites have been found in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, in Australia. The evidence for prehistoric massacres, for the systematic killing of entire communities rather than the individual violence of personal conflict, is scattered across the archaeological record with grim consistency. But what did prehistoric warfare actually look like day to day? Not the massacres, which were the extreme outcome, but the ordinary texture of violence in a world without armies or states or formal rules of engagement. The anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon at the University of Michigan spent decades living among and studying the Yanomami people of Venezuela and Brazil, one of the last populations on Earth living in conditions that archaeologists believe approximate those of late Paleolithic societies. Chagnon's research, which generated enormous controversy and which must be approached with the understanding that the Yanomami are a modern people and not prehistoric humans, nevertheless provided the closest available window into the social dynamics of small-scale warfare. What Chagnon found was that Yanomami conflict operated on multiple scales simultaneously. Individual personal disputes, often over women or perceived slights, could escalate through a predictable social logic into community-level violence. Villages raided each other, Alliances formed and broke apart. The threat of violence shaped every social interaction, every negotiation, every alliance. And crucially, men who had killed in warfare, who Chagnon called unokais, had, on average, 2.5 times more children than men who had not killed. Violence, in this social environment, was not just a threat to survival, it was a reproductive strategy. The men who were most effective at violence, and at organizing and leading violent groups, left more descendants. This finding, which Chagnon published in the journal Science in 1988, remains one of the most controversial in the history of anthropology. But it sits alongside a growing body of evidence from ancient DNA and paleodemography that ancient warfare was not just common, but evolutionary significant. The Harvard geneticist David Reich, whose work on ancient human DNA has transformed our understanding of prehistoric population dynamics, has found evidence of catastrophic population replacements across prehistoric Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Entire populations disappearing from the genetic record, replaced by incoming populations from elsewhere. Not the slow diffusion of culture and genes through peaceful contact, but the rapid replacement characteristic of conquest and displacement. The best documented of these replacements involves the Yamnaya people, a nomadic pastoral population from the Pontic-Caspian steppe of what is now Ukraine and Russia. Around 5,000 years ago, Yamnaya-related populations spread westward into Europe with extraordinary speed. Within a few centuries, genetic studies show male lineages in much of Europe had been almost entirely replaced. The women of the prior populations remained in the genetic record, but the men largely did not. The interpretation that most geneticists and archaeologists favor is not peaceful migration and cultural assimilation. It is violent conquest, with male populations being killed or displaced and female populations being absorbed. This pattern of male populations being eliminated and female populations being incorporated appears repeatedly in the ancient DNA record across different times and places. It is consistent with the ethnographic record of small-scale warfare documented across dozens of cultures around the world, and it means that, if you are of European or South Asian descent, a significant portion of your ancestry comes from people who were extraordinarily successful at organized violence approximately 5,000 years ago. Your genome carries the signature of their conquest. But with the earliest states, taxation to fund armies, writing to keep records of those taxes and coordinate military logistics, law to manage the internal disputes of larger and more complex communities, religion organized to sanctify the political order and motivate warriors to fight and die, the city wall, the granary, the specialized warrior caste, the bureaucracy that tracks resources and coordinates their distribution, all of these developed in the context of military competition. The earliest known writing in the world, the clay tablets of ancient Sumer dating to approximately 3200 BC, is not poetry or philosophy. It is administrative records, lists of goods, accounts of resources, the bureaucratic infrastructure of a society organized in significant part around the logistics of collective violence. But warfare did not only build institutions at the societal level, it built the human psychology you carry inside you right now.